So I don't know where the Trump play is other than to simply bluster. Because here's the difference. I quite often I call Trump a mafia boss, the Don. Don Corleone, Godfather guy, he knew where his next move was. He knew where his leverage was, where his pressure points was. This particular mafia boss in the White House, all he knows is to shout tariffs.
I am Maddie, Hale, and welcome to the Trump Report. I have had a month off work and I've come back to our own independent channel where we're going to be broadcasting the Trump Report every day, Monday through Friday, up until January 2029. So if you want all your news when it comes to Donald Trump, his administration, international affairs, you can find it here. We have expert guests on every single day. And to kick off my new year, we have Professor Scott Lucas from the Clinton Institute at the University College Dublin. Scott, thank you so much for joining the show.
Welcome back to the asylum, Maddie.
I mean, I couldn't have picked a more problematic time to be taking 4 weeks off work to go home to Oz. So much has happened in the last 4 weeks, but I want to start off with what is happening right now, which is, of course, this Greenland debacle. Now, over the weekend, Donald Trump threatened to impose tariffs starting at 10%, potentially reaching 25% on 8 EU countries, including Denmark, Sweden, Germany, the UK, the Netherlands, Finland, and Norway, unless they support the United States buying Greenland off Denmark. The EU has now reportedly prepared to strike back with their own set of tariffs on the United States worth around 93 billion euros. So, Scott, walk me through this escalation of back and forth between these allies.
No. Well, where we are right now is that Trump personally is in the middle of a huge tantrum that would make a 3-year-old look positively mature. He is upset still that he didn't get the Nobel Peace Prize, even though the actual winner of the prize, Maria Machado of Colombia, presented it to him, trying to curry favor a few days ago. And he was really upset that his initial bullying attempts to seize Greenland, including the threat of military force, that European nations and Canada responded with what was a symbolic move, which was to send a few military personnel up to Greenland to say, we're with you. So that's why the tariffs have targeted particular countries. It's Denmark, of course, because remember, Greenland is part of Denmark. But then it's 7 European countries that sent troops. The UK sent 1 military officer, and so they get to be on the naughty list. Then you have the Nordic countries, Sweden, Finland, and Norway, and then Netherlands, France, and Germany. Now, Trump has said, look, I'm going to impose these on February 1st because this is Trump's bullying tactic, which is, I'm going to give you a few days to reconsider your position and then give me what I want. Classic mafia boss behavior. And then he says, if you're still thinking about it come the 1st of June, I'm going to raise this to 25%. But Maddie, I think we have to emphasize this is more than just Trump that's in play here. I mean, there is a Trump administration, or at least some of the members of the Trump administration who also are in on this. So let me give you, first of all, the really troubling signal yesterday that I think bypassed most people, although the White House has now responded. A friend of mine who was in the intelligence services, I'll say no more than that, when the news came out that the White House was talking about deploying a military unit to Minnesota to back up ISIS abuses, detentions, even killings up there, he noticed that the unit they were talking about sending was 1,500 members from the Army 11th Airborne Division. Now, the Army 11th Airborne Division is America's only Arctic specialist military unit. Now, Minnesota's pretty damn cold this time of year, but it's not in the Arctic. Guess who is in the Arctic? Now, this caused a little bit of attention on social media, so the White House overnight came out with a statement, oh, no, it's Minnesota that we're sending them to, even though they don't have legal authority to send them into Minnesota. That just shows you, look, how far can they go? Because if you look at J.D. Vance, and Vance is not as out front in terms of his social media account, But Vance has made it clear he wants to undermine the European Union. Vance has made it clear he would like to put hard right governments into power in Europe and in the UK. It's in the U.S. national security strategy last month. So how does Greenland fit into that? You undermine Greenland, you weaken Denmark. You weaken Denmark, you weaken the EU. By the by, you also weaken NATO. But Vance don't care because Vance, not isolationist. That's how people misread this Trump, folks. They're not isolationist. They are talking about America being the only global power, only global power. You add in Pete Hegseth, who just wants to get into a scrap with someone somewhere because he wants to prove his macho warrior culture. And then you talk about folks who are now serving as Trump's lackeys. And on Sunday, that was Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, who was just simply supporting all of this, even though in private, Bessent has supposedly told Trump, look, you're going too far here. You are going too far. The European response, and I'm going to say this personally, and then put the analyst hat on, I was really heartened by the European response over the weekend. Because we know the EU can be very bureaucratic. We know that it doesn't always move in the same place. Almost every European capital coordinated with each other. And so when Trump threw his wobbler and said, we're going to slap tariffs on you, they came out and held the line and said, no, Greenland's Danish sovereignty and Greenland's status is a red line here. You do not mess with this. And we are not going to give way to you. Keir Starmer's initial statement was a bit milder than that, but he has toughened it up this morning. And the message is coming back that, look, if you really want to push this, 10%, 25%, whatever, we will consider sweeping tariffs against 93 billion euros worth of U.S. imports into Europe. It just so happens that you remember that deal that we had last, it wasn't really a deal, it was a framework, but the one last August, the 15th, that the EU held off on retaliatory 15% tariffs because they wanted to see how this all settled out with Trump. It just so happens that the deadline on making a decision on whether or not to implement that retaliation comes up at the start of February. So now it's like you have it. But then just really quickly, one additional thing to watch is this mention of what's called the anti-coercion instrument. Now, this was devised in 2023 for use against the Chinese. Like if the Chinese are going to try to bully Europe economically, if they're making threats against Taiwan, then the EU can respond with tariffs against China. Now they're saying, well, do we use it against the U.S.? And there were some officials starting to mention this over the weekend. And then Emmanuel Macron raised it on Sunday. And so this is now a topic for discussion as we get into the EU leaders meeting, which will take place on Thursday, I believe.
Yeah, dozens of EU leaders will hold this emergency meeting this week, as you mentioned, in response to the tariff threats. But I wonder, Scott, we've seen Donald Trump in 2025, the use of tariffs as weaponization and threats was a big focal point of his first year back in office. These tariffs that he's threatened EU leaders with will come into effect February 1st, as you mentioned, potentially in later in the year, reaching up to 25%. But what we saw with his original tariff threats last year is that, yes, while some were implemented, a lot of them were walked back, they were paused, they were used for further negotiations, they were even challenged legally. So can this just be all talk from Trump?
No, it's not all talk. And I need to emphasize, it's not all talk because it's not just Trump. That's what I've got to emphasize. And I want to make one connection before I address the question. Venezuela is thousands of miles from Denmark and Greenland, but these two are connected. When they went in and kidnapped Nicolas Maduro, at that point, they were thinking maybe regime change in Venezuela. Then it becomes regime coercion. The broader point of that, and this is also in the national security strategy, is this is our Western Hemisphere. We do whatever we want to. Now, what they're doing in Greenland is, beyond the immediate issues of the rare earth minerals that we can talk about, beyond other economic motives that they've got, is we want to show dominance over Europe. And so the problem here is that you can't really back off this as easy as you could from like, oh, those, how high should the tariff levels be last year? But the Trump administration's got a real problem here, or at least the Trump cult that's going after this. And that is, it's like a dog chasing a parked car. Yep, 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 right? And they caught that parked car in Venezuela. Yep, 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 yep. And then it was like, wait a minute, what are we going to do with the parked car? And it's like, okay, we got Maduro. We're going to steal some oil, which they've done. But it's then like, well, what are you going to do with the country? And where we are with Venezuela, just a quick reminder, is they didn't get rid of the Maduro regime. Maduro's the only official they took. And the vice president is now acting president. The interior minister, very powerful figure, still in place. Defense minister, he's still in place. And so, Venezuelans who oppose the regime are actually going, wait, what? What are you doing here? The Iranian regime, during the Iranian protests that have just taken place, and they have quelled these, they have killed thousands of protesters to quell them, and Trump's going, yeah, I'm going to bomb you, I'm going to bomb you, I'm going to bomb you. The Iranians sent him a message and said, oh, we promise not to kill any more people or execute them. And Trump went, okay. Now, here we go with Denmark. Yeah, give me Denmark, give me Denmark, give me Denmark, or I'll do this. And Europe says no. And I think equally important, probably more important, is not only does Denmark say no, Greenlanders say no. Almost every Greenlander says no. Well, what are you going to do now, right? If you send in the military, it is the end of NATO as we know it, right? If you try to say, Greenland, you become independent, and then you give us priority economic access, and we'll run your defense and foreign policy. Well, very few people in Greenland are going to do that now. And in fact, even Greenland's most ardent pro-independence party has said, look, we're parking this for the moment. We're not going to discuss independence. We're allied here with Denmark until we get out of this crisis situation. So I don't know where the Trump play is other than to simply bluster. Because here's the difference. I quite often call Trump a mafia boss, the Don. Don Corleone, Godfather guy, he knew where his next move was. He knew where his leverage was, where his pressure points was. This particular mafia boss in the White House, all he knows is to shout tariffs. That's all he really knows. And I don't think he's got a play beyond that. But I think more surprising is I don't think Vance has a play beyond this right now, except, and I will hold this out, I think the play may have been, look, we'll stir up the hard right parties in Europe. We'll stir all them up. And that hasn't worked. What has been interesting here is not only Georgia Maloney siding strongly with Greenland, because Maloney's become quite pragmatic. I think she's very pro-EU. She's been very pro-Ukraine against Don's buddy Putin. Not only other governments across Europe said we stand with Greenland, but hard right parties said this is not acceptable. The National Rally in France said this is not acceptable. AFD has distanced themselves from the Trump folks, and the Trump folks were all behind AFD, have been, and the Reform Party.
Nigel Farage.
Yeah, Farage has come out and said, oh no, this. So I think even for those hard right parties that Vance and his camp were thinking we'll use them to undermine Europe, they've drawn a line here at least so far. Now whether they can be bullied or swung around to accept this, I don't know.
Scott, how much of a delicate dance do you think this is right now for NATO while trying to not fan the flame with Trump in order to keep negotiations on ending the Russia-Ukraine alive, but not pandering to his authoritarianism over Greenland?
Oh, all you got to do is look at the latest statement of the NATO head, Mark Rutte, and see how much he's wobbling on that tightrope. Remember, Mark Rutte was like, the guy who called Trump daddy. And while all the European leaders have come out pretty firmly with Greenland, Rutte's latest statement doesn't even mention the Greenland issue. It just says, we maintain good communications with Washington, yada, yada, yada. But I think it is important for those who say, why doesn't the EU just go all in, bash Trump? We are at such a sensitive moment in the Ukraine-Russia situation as we come up to the 4th anniversary of the full-scale invasion. We have this Ukraine-Europe plan, which had succeeded in getting the Americans involved in security guarantees. The Americans are to lead the air support part of the security guarantees. Now that beds in U.S. intelligence sharing. It beds in the fact that the U.S. has been selling military equipment via NATO to Ukraine. Ukraine and Europe played a blinder to get that only 3 months, less than 3 months after the ultimatum that the Kremlin had designed with Trump's boys, real estate developer Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner. So Ukraine and Europe had not only pushed that back, they had spun this around. Now, here we are, which is Witkoff and Kushner are soon going to Moscow. Now, in fact, Kirill Dmitriev, who's the point guy the Kremlin has working with them, he's announced today that he's going to be seeing them. Do Witkoff and Kushner present the Ukraine-European plan and say to the Kremlin, look, ceasefire, you don't get more territory, Ukraine gets security guarantees. Do they stick with that, or do they all of a sudden swing back into Vladimir's pocket? And so, obviously Mark Rutte doesn't want them to swing back into Vlad's pocket and undo months of work, so he plays it very cautious. And Vladimir Zelensky, by the way, is playing it very cautious as well. You'll notice that he will not criticize Trump over Greenland because it's like, my priority is going to be right here. So yeah, you have got to balance these two issues, but you have to draw a red line on both fronts. You cannot compromise on one for the sake of the other.
Can Trump continue, or Trump admin officials, including Steve Witkoff, as you said, can they continue to negotiate the end of the Russia-Ukraine war, which includes discussions of land concessions when he himself wants to take Greenland off Denmark and has threatened, US officials have even said the military action is always an option. So, the irony of discussing land concessions in Ukraine with the Kremlin while also orchestrating, potentially an invasion of Greenland or trying to buy or even take Greenland off Denmark.
Oh, you can still push on Ukraine with Vlad because Vlad's not exactly a moral or ethical guy who's going to say, oh, look at me. Well, you've threatened Greenland.
I know, Scott, but is he at least looking at Trump thinking, what? Like, you clearly want to do it yourself.
What they're looking at this is they're looking at how they can leverage Trump with Greenland on the specific issue, first of all, about pushing back Ukraine and Europe over the plan, right? So what they're going to do is when Witkoff and Kushner come in there and say, look, if you want us to accept what you're doing in Greenland, if you want us to accept you trying to expand your sphere of influence, you've got to stop pushing on us and you've got to let us expand our sphere of influence in Ukraine. In other words, it would be a deal between two mafia bosses to carve up the various territories that they control. But then there's a wider play here that they're in. All you have to do is watch Russian state TV. And that is, on the one hand, they go, oh, tut, we're not sure this is a good idea to invade Greenland. But then they say, oh, Greenland is an issue for Greenlanders. But then they say, through Dmitry Peskov, the Kremlin spokesman this morning, this could be a historic moment. It's like, and Trump wants to be historic. And it's like, this could be a historic moment, Mr. Trump, which is like, oh, go on, do it. Go on, do it. Because they want to destabilize Europe, right? And that's the play here is that you have the risk where they're almost in a win-win situation, which is that if Europe takes a firm stand against Trump over Greenland, it ticks Trump off. And then he tries to bash Trump over Ukraine. And if Europe folds its hand before Trump over Greenland, it shows European weakness that it doesn't maintain support for countries that are resisting aggression. So this whole situation benefits the Kremlin right now in general terms. Whether they can specifically use it to undo those Ukraine-Europe proposals, that's what we wait and see.
You said, Scott, that several members of Trump's team are incredibly supportive of his desire to take Greenland. But we have seen publicly a few Republican lawmakers come out and criticising this plan. So we saw Michael McCall call this a war with NATO. Tom Tillis said that it was beyond stupid. We've seen Don Bacon say that this is a foolish policy. So those are just a few that I've named. But I wonder behind closed doors how divided the Republican Party is when it comes to this situation, especially as we have seen a lot of them really vote on the America First agenda.
Well, they're split. But let me emphasize before we get to that the administration is split. That's why I'll talk about a Trump cult, a Trump cabal, right? Because I don't think Marco Rubio is on board with this. Now, Rubio's quite happy for American dominance in the Western Hemisphere. I mean, he was leading the charge for regime change in Venezuela. But Rubio, I think, is one of those, traditional Republicans going back to the Reagan era, which is we work with Europe here. We don't work against it. But probably more importantly, there's a whole load of career officials that they have not purged in the Pentagon, intelligence services, State Department, Treasury. Their careers have been built upon the idea of the U.S. works with Europe. This is almost an 80-year alliance that we're talking about here. So I think you've got a split that's there in the administration. But in terms of Congress, that's what's going to grab headlines right now. Right now, it isn't a firm pushback yet on the Trump folks, because a couple of those folks you named were already coming out and criticizing Trump's on other issues. Tom Tillis, the senator from North Carolina, Don Bacon, the representative from Nebraska, and they're both retiring. So it's like, okay, you guys are lame ducks. Anyway, Michael McCaul, and I'm glad you mentioned that, that's more important, although a lot of the media haven't picked up on it, because he was chairman of House Foreign Affairs Committee at one point, right? And so that's an interesting voice. A lot of Republicans, as they always do right now, they're just keeping powder dry, right? I do think that the first sign that you have that U.S. military forces are going in to invade Greenland, I think there's going to be hell to pay for the Trump folks. I think that's a red line, because let's be honest here, if the Trump folks did that, it not only is shattering NATO, they have already fractured the Republican Party and possibly broken it. They would have blown it to bits, because the Republican Party has been built on an idea of security based on these cooperative relationships with other countries.
So you're saying, Scott, you'll see more Republican lawmakers come out and criticize Trump if he sends US militants into Greenland? Because before, when there was discussion over this, Riviera of the Middle East and how that would kind of be structured, the conversation of US troops on the ground in Gaza was discussed, and several members of Congress came out and said, absolutely not, that's where we draw the line. We don't want US troops in Gaza. So it would be a similar situation in the sense that a lot of Americans in the Republican Party, but Americans in general, would be not happy with sending US troops to Greenland.
Yeah, I think the polls were around about 4 to 6% actually support military action against Greenland. And that includes, only a very small minority of Republicans that are backing it. There are more who would support the U.S. taking Greenland if they can get it through non-military means, but that's still only around, I think, about 15%. So this is clearly not a vote winner. Now, where I think, not for me to advise the Trump folks, I mean, they wouldn't listen to me. I don't want to help them anyway. But, I'm wondering, wouldn't the play here be to expand the American troops who are already in Greenland? Because, fundamental, because let's cut against the disinformation, because you missed all the fun I've had over the last few weeks, Maddie, with Trumpists who've come on and said all kinds of rubbish, and having to come back and say, well, you do know that the U.S. and Denmark have had an agreement since 1951 to defend Greenland. You had 17 bases at one point during the Cold War. You could send in more American military units to expand their presence in in their one base, Patuxent. And then they could go in and they could walk around Nuuk and they could parade their uniforms, the capital, which has about 20,000 people. But that doesn't look tough guy enough, right? And I think that's where the Trump folks get undone, because there's talk the talk and walk the walk. Trump's going to talk the talk, including his latest verbal declaration that he no longer wants to be the president of peace, but he wants to be the president of war, because he didn't get the Nobel Peace Prize. But then you have to walk the walk. And it's one thing to do it with Venezuela, because you don't have an alliance that you're threatening to shatter. It's another to do it with Cuba, which they're threatening. Here, it's going to be the U.S. versus 31 NATO allies, 1 versus 31. The EU's got a larger economic bloc than the U.S. does. Now, the U.S. has got most of the world's largest companies based there, but the EU's got a lot of economic power. And I think Republican senators and representatives are going, well, wait a minute. Our constituencies, we're going to be the first to get hurt if these tariffs escalate. We'll be the first. We will not be the last here. And do they want to really go down that path? And just a quick reminder, if Trump does not succeed in scuttling the elections in November, we're already in a path where within a few weeks, there's going to be election fever in many of these constituencies.
I wonder if the fact that you mentioned military presence in Greenland and the fact that US obviously already has some, if Donald Trump isn't pursuing further military presence by putting more troops there, maybe another base with the agreement of Greenland, the agreement with Denmark, what does that say to you about what his actual strategy is with taking over Greenland? So if it's not about expanding the military presence, then perhaps it is about having more land and more dominance in the West, but also maybe it's about making more money with these rare earth minerals.
Yeah, go. I mean, go watch Trump as a businessman. Go back historically. Go watch him as the "you're fired" guy. Right? It's a bully. Everything about Trump is, I'm going to go in and I'm going to demand you. If you don't give me that, I'll take you to court. If you don't do that, I'll send people around to talk to you tough and all that. And it's always the question of if people will stand up to him bullying. Yeah. A lot of people don't, for obvious reasons. They don't have the funds to stand up to it. They don't have the backing to stand up to it. But those who stand up to Trump, you can back him down. You can certainly back it down because it's in like, okay, make your next move, Donald. Now, here we are, and let's just cut to the chase of what's happening here. I think Greenland's got, 25 of the world's 34 rare earth minerals? I think last time I checked, those are approximate numbers. There are folks around Trump from his business world who want to get in on the act. And one of those people who wants to get in on the act is his boy, Donald Trump Jr., who's parading himself around Greenland several months ago. Now, you're talking trillions of dollars that could be involved in Greenland. Now, there's a way that they could go in and get those rare earth minerals right now, which is they go to the Danish government and they try to get contracts for tender to develop this. But Trump doesn't want to do it that way. See, that's too messy. That takes too much time, and you have to effectively give Denmark something to do that. Here, you bully them. And you have had Trump acolytes over the past few days who have effectively said, if you don't accept this, it'll get worse for you. It has absolutely been a shakedown tactic. But the shakedown is not going to stop there. And I'm going to repeat, and so on. I don't, if you have other resources that the Trump folks want around the world, they'll try to figure out a way to seize it. They'll try to back you down. They will try to exploit Europe economically by threatening on other issues to jack up the tariffs. They're going to do that until the economic damage hits them in the United States. Now, whether that's 3 months, 6 months, a year, we'll see. I will say, just as a quick reminder of this, I want to give you a very provocative analogy because I used it on overnight with Times Radio with one of your colleagues who went, what, really? I thank the good Lord above that Northern Ireland, the North, does not have rare earth minerals because Trump and his folks could walk in to Northern Ireland and say, oh, we've had an area here which has had all kinds of turmoil in the past, and we've had people who have demanded independence from Great Britain there, or possibly. And you know what? You've got the issue of maritime security with the Atlantic and the Irish Sea. Britain can't defend Northern Ireland. We can. Now I don't think that's going to happen, but that tells you that once you open up the door for him to bully in Greenland, he'll just be empowered. Because what do you do with a bully? You punch him in the nose. That's how you respond.
I mean, there's a lot of comparisons here that you can make with Putin and his expansionism on this, Scott. But further escalation on this Greenland stuff broke out today when reports were circulating that Trump had sent a text message to Norway's Prime Minister, Jonas Gahr Støre. So this is what it said. It said, "Dear Jonas, considering your country decided not to give me the Nobel Peace Prize for having stopped 8 wars plus, I no longer feel an obligation to think purely of peace, although it will always be predominant, but can now think about what is good and proper for the United States. Denmark cannot protect that land from Russia or China, and why do they have a right of ownership anyway? There are no written documents. It's only that a boat landed there hundreds of years ago, but we had boats landing there also. I have done more for NATO than any other person since its founding, and now NATO should do something for the US. The world is not secure unless we have complete and total control of Greenland." I mean, your reaction to this text message. Imagine receiving that.
You big old man, baby. I swear to God. I mean, I said it makes a 3-year-old look mature. Let me walk you back before that message came out, because what I found equally interesting was the message that was sent by the presidents of Finland and Norway to Trump. It was a very informal message, which said, look, we want to talk to you about the security of Greenland. So in other words, you've got an issue. You've got a point here. You've got a point about Greenland needing to be secure because of the changing nature of the Arctic cap and the waterways. We want to talk to you about it. And at the very end said, look, we'll talk to you together, or you can talk to us separately. And then they add an exclamation point, and that way you do it. Exclamation point. And it's like, and they signed it, Alex and Jonas, right? Alex Stubb and Jonas Storr. And it's like, okay, that's a pretty friendly letter. And then you just read out the Trump response, which is, I should have gotten the Nobel Peace Prize. I should be like the emperor, the galactic czar of peace. And if you don't call me that, I'm going to attack everybody. Right? I no longer believe in peace. And it's like, and we've had friends over here this morning, and it was, people who alongside us here in Ireland who came and said, look, is that real? Is it real? Does he really believe this? And what I said to them, to take this to a personal level and so on, I'm just going to see if this resonates with you or with others. When my parents got much older, and now my mom's in her 80s, my dad passed last year in the 80s, they would say things that at first that they didn't really believe, right? When you're kids, how they shine it on with us and so on. You go to your room or else, blah, blah. But as they get older, they start to believe in their heads that this is what the reality is. And I think Trump genuinely thinks that he has brought peace to the world. And if anybody doesn't agree with that, he's going to beat them up. I think that is the space that he is in right now, whether it's Greenland, whether it's Venezuela, or whether it's other countries. And I say that to you because, again, you say, will he back down this time? If he is in his head like this, that everything comes down to whether it's a personal insult or not, you are well beyond where he was in the first term. You're at a point now where this idea of appeasing Trump, it might keep him quiet for a bit, but it is not going to work in the long run.
This is awkward timing, this text message, along with everything else that's escalated in the last 2 days since his tariff threats on Saturday. But, several of these EU leaders and Trump will reunite this week. Today at the Davos Economic Forum. So, how awkward this is going to be, but also how much preparation do you think these EU leaders are doing in order to try and deter Trump away from this rhetoric?
He pitches up in Davos on Wednesday. I think he's there Wednesday, Thursday. So they've got 2 days space here working hopefully with adults up there. They will have been preparing for this, Maddie, in a general sense for months, right? Because, in fact, in some cases for years, because this is the way Trump is. But to build on the other point, Trump's getting worse now. And I do honestly think, and maybe we do this in a different Trump report, I do think mentally and physically, he's got some real health issues here that are exacerbating this. So you have to factor that in if you're European leaders. They will have consulted with their agencies, with their intel agencies, with their diplomatic agencies, with their militaries.
Scott, sorry to interrupt, because I do want to get clarification. We don't have any proof that he's got any health issues right now.
We don't have the proof because the White House isn't releasing reliable information, right?
But no White House would.
Well, we know the Biden White House didn't either, right?
Yeah.
Now, there was a time when White Houses did release information that was reliable, right? There was a time. And let's firmly acknowledge that the Biden White House, in a way, completely screwed up and should never have put us in that position. But the thing that differentiates Biden between Trump here is that while Biden was losing it, he wasn't threatening to throw the world into apocalyptic disorder. And so there's a little bit of a difference in scale of magnitude. Let's get back to Davos here. Remember that it's not just Trump who will be at Davos. There's going to be all kinds of American business folks there. There'll be American technology folks there. There will be other American officials there. And you work around Trump to try to get to those people who you think have a bit of an understanding that we need to step back from this point. And a lot of those discussions will not make headlines. Part of the problem here is, of course, that those discussions, which are to try to get this to a sensible basis, whether it's Greenland, whether it's the wider future of NATO, the EU, the press don't headline them because these are taking place quietly, discreetly. All it takes is Trump or Vance to say some whack job line, and then we're back into the mess where everybody is chasing this. So I think the EU, in some respects, what they're going to have to try to do is get ahead of this. They've got to get ahead of the latest Trump thought bubble by getting to those officials and saying, here are the lines that we're going to be talking about here. And the lines on Greenland are really so clear. This is what makes it such a screwed up case to bring us to the point of transatlantic crisis. That if you have a concern that because of the waterways around Greenland, that other countries could challenge it, let's say Russia and China, then you consult with NATO. That's a no-brainer, because that's what NATO is there for, right? And that's what you reinforce when you're talking at Davos. And if you're concerned about this, you talk about economic cooperation between countries to strengthen both sides, and you don't get into a lose-lose tariff war. That's the sensible position that we're taking. Are there enough adults in the American room now that will listen to that? Because it is now not just Trump, not just Vance, but let's throw another part into the mix. J.D. Vance wants to be president in 2028. J.D. Vance wants to do it on the basis of America is the only power. That's where he's going to play. Who's the guy that made J.D. Vance? Peter Thiel. What does Peter Thiel come out of? Now we're in tech bro territory, right? We're in tech bro territory, and all that means not only in terms of AI, it also means in terms of contracts they can get, defense contracts, other government contracts, in terms of effectively, we put ourselves at the top of the heap here, right? When you talk about a Peter Thiel or an Elon Musk, those guys don't believe in cooperation either. Those guys are very much, it's our way or the highway. That's the challenge that not just Europe, but the rest of the world faces right now.
Scott, I want to get into Vladimir Putin and a few updates on him. So the Washington Post published an article today that argues that Putin's credibility is eroding because Russia has failed to deliver decisive results in Ukraine. So it cannot effectively protect its allies or its assets and appears hesitant to confront US pressure. So at the same time, reportedly frustration is growing with pro-war elites and the public, weakening both Putin's international standing, but also his domestic authority. So the quote that the Washington Post has used is that as allies like Venezuela, Syria and Iran get picked off or bombed, Putin's international promises ring more hollow than ever and his lies are no longer entertained. So several times I've had various military analysts, and Sir Bill Browder says this all the time, that if Putin doesn't deliver on results on the war, he will likely be killed. Because so many Russians inside are saying, what's the point of this war if we're not going to, get headway, and why are we so poor, and vice versa, and goes on. So do you agree that his credibility is eroding inside Russia, especially with these pro-war Russians and Kremlin officials?
Well, let's take it step by step. First of all, the point where I'm in agreement is that he's on the back foot internationally. And he's on the back foot over Ukraine because he hasn't been able to make Ukraine surrender. And what you're seeing right now, again, possibly something for a future videocast, is this all-out war to try to break Ukraine's energy infrastructure. You try to freeze and black out Ukrainians so that they give up. And there are now the most intense Russian strikes of the invasion going on. The reason why they're so intense with that is that they're not winning on the front line, and that they've got to question how far can they go into 2026 in terms of the resources to support the invasion. In the meantime, he's had a huge setback in Syria, if you want to walk back to the end of 2024. So Russia, which had backed the Assad regime, loses out there. Russia has lost out in Venezuela because, of course, they were backing the Maduro regime as an alternative to American power. They had the prospect that they were going to lose another, if not an ally, another country that worked with them, with the regime in Iran being in trouble. So, their international standing, which has always been this myth of BRICS and, that they have all these other countries they work with, they're looking even more and more isolated internationally. And they took a specific punch to the nose from the Americans when the Americans intercepted the tanker that reflagged and renamed itself south of Iceland, even though the Russians said, we've got a sub there, we've got vessels watching this. And the Americans went, yeah, big deal. We're taking the tanker anyway. Now, what does that mean inside Russia? Maddie, I'm just very cautious about this, and I'm cautious about it for a couple of reasons. One is, I think actually the Bill Browder statement kind of works the other way in the near term, and that is, it means that Putin can't afford to give up in a way which is, look, because it's his legacy. His legacy was he was going to make Ukraine part of Greater Russia. The guy's in his 70s. Maybe he's got 10, 15 years left. Maybe he's only got a couple. This was going to be like what I'm going to give the Russian people. Peter the Great, Ivan the Terrible, Vlad the Impaler, and in this case, he impales Ukraine and he makes it part of Russia. Well, he hasn't been able to deliver on that. And he's not even able to deliver on all of Donetsk at this region. I think that just makes him more aggressive. And he's not going to agree to a ceasefire. Now, how long can he continue the invasion? For most Russians, it's like, where are you on a day-to-day basis? Are you still getting fed? Do you still have a house over your head? Do you still have electricity, right? Do you get payments if your relatives get killed? If the Russian state can continue to deliver that, then they probably don't rise up. They don't say, look, enough is enough. When the Russian state stops providing for that basic security, then he's got issues. Other factor, look, in 23, we could talk about the Wagner Group rebellion. And we know that probably had some people in the Russian military who were working with it. Putin survived it, crushed it, right? Who takes a swing at him? Even if he's losing in Ukraine, who takes a swing at him? It's one thing to say he might be killed. Where does it come from? Within his inner circle, intelligence services, military? So I think it's a little bit more complicated with respect to Bill Browder than simply saying, well, this definitely is going to happen.
Just a final question, Scott. Last year when Trump was brokering this peace deal with Israel and Hamas, there was this peace plan and it involved, down the track creating this board of peace. Now, the update with it today is that Trump has invited President Vladimir Putin to join this board of peace. So this is the international body that intends to oversee Gaza's peace process. Later, we'll delve into other conflicts, but Moscow has replied saying it's reviewing the offer with diplomatic channels. The board, which will initially focus on the Israel-Hamas ceasefire back in 2025, will also kind of go into Gaza's reconstruction. Sir Tony Blair's in this, other participants will be in this, but I mean, Vladimir Putin to be on the board of peace, your reaction to this?
George Orwell is applauding you from his grave. Dear God. All right, we're back to mafia bosses, right? Even if in this case you got a mafia boss in Washington who's a man baby at the same time. I get to be president of the world, or emperor, galactic emperor of the world, whatever I'm going to call myself. And it's like he has, just to widen this out, he's proposing now multiple boards of peace. There's going to be a board of peace for Gaza, a board of peace for Venezuela, a board of peace for Ukraine, right? And let's bring it back to Gaza. First of all, it's not even going to work before you get to Vladimir Putin. And let me explain why. We're several months after the October ceasefire. The Israelis occupy about 53% of Gaza. The other 47%, Hamas is still there, has not been disarmed, has not been broken up. But the Trump folks say, oh, we're going to move to phase 2 anyway. Who's on this board of peace, which is largely ceremonial? But let's talk about it. Donald is, of course, right? And then Jared's there, his son-in-law. Real estate developer Steve Witkoff is there, right? And then Tony Blair, who's well known for his peaceful efforts with Iraq in 2003. Here's something that is the real story about this. Not only do you have the Board of Peace, you have an executive board that oversees the Palestinian transitional group, right? The Israelis have said they're not going to accept. They're not going to accept because they don't want any involvement from Turkey or Qatar, because they think Turkey and Qatar helped Hamas. So the idea right now is a flaming non-starter. But what happens? Because Trump and Putin each want to be the big guys and be important, the Kremlin says, well, look, we got invited. We got invited to come onto the Board of Peace. What's going to happen when Witkoff and Kirshner go to Moscow? They're going to go, we'd like to be on your Board of Peace for Gaza, but we really need to discuss Ukraine. Maybe we could have a Board of Peace for Ukraine after we get more territory and after we make Ukraine weak. That's the real risk of this harebrained scheme that's going out there. I will add the fact that, Maddie, I don't want to belittle the story because it's part of the craziness that is there. The reason why I think, however, we may not be facing an abyss with Vlad being on a port of peace for Gaza and for Ukraine is because Trump is also reportedly demanding that anyone who wants to be on his board of peace has to pay him $1 billion. $1 billion. Now, Vlad, I'm sure, could probably put his hands on $1 billion if he wants to, but he really would prefer to spend that money on continuing to invade Ukraine.
Professor Scott Lucas, thank you so much for joining the Trump Report.
Thank you. Let's do this again real soon, and welcome back again.